Railways have served many purposes throughout the years, from transportation of minerals to transporting people. There was, however, one railway that served a very different and unique purpose, not to transport or move materials en masse, but rather to exploit a loophole in specific maritime laws so a company could deliver fish. In 1920, after evaluating the effect naval blockades from the First World War had on shipping, the United States put laws in place to ensure that any goods being shipped between US ports would be exclusively done by US ships. The Jones Act, as it is known, requires that any ship transporting goods or people from one US port to another must have been built in the US out of at least 90% US steel, be owned by a US citizen, at least 70% of the crew be US citizens, and it must fly the US flag. This way, companies can't outsource transportation work to cheap foreign ships, and ensures that things being shipped from one US port to another is done exclusively by US ships and follows all the rules and guidelines set in place by the Act. Some northern shipping companies tried to get around this by delivering to ports in Canada, and from there moving the supplies by land to its intended destination in the US. However, as the final destination of the cargo was still the US, the Act still applied, meaning that unless the ship carrying the cargo was US built and operated, the company would be hit with a hefty fine and a lot of legal trouble. This meant that if a company wanted to get around the Jones Act, they would have to get creative, which is exactly what the American Seafood Group did. In the 1980s, American Seafood began transporting fish from Dutch Harbor in Alaska to Maine via the Panama Canal. Because the ship would be traveling from one US port to another, the Jones Act would apply. However, a clause in the Jones Act, known as the Third Proviso, specified that if any part of the route travels along a Canadian railway line, then the shipment is exempt from the Act. As such, American Seafood was able to use cheaper foreign-flagged ships by unloading their fish in New Brunswick, Canada, and transporting them to Maine via the New Brunswick and Southern Railway. From there, the fish would be loaded into trucks and sent to their intended destination. While this loophole worked for many years, ideally when transporting cargo, especially something that can spoil such as raw fish, you want to make as few stops as possible to decrease journey time. Having to pay the railroad to move the fish and spend time loading and unloading was a lot of trouble to save money on shipping. Ideally, American Seafood wanted to just load the fish straight into awaiting trucks, but unless the fish were transported via Canadian Railway at some point, they'd have to obey the Jones Act and pay all the additional costs that came with it. But then one day in 2012, someone at American Seafood had an awfully devious idea. They proposed that the ships unload the fish at Bayside Harbour in New Brunswick, a port that is literally less than 30 minutes drive away from the border to Maine. The fish would be loaded directly into the trucks that would take them to their intended destination in Maine via road. Before the trucks set off, however, they would be loaded onto a railway flatbed wagon and moved back and forth along a short section of track on the bay. This track would be legally classified as a railway and the journey would take less than a minute to complete. The truck would then be driven off the flatbed and could then drive the 26 kilometers into Maine, and from there deliver the fish. By doing this, the ship technically wouldn't have arrived at a US port, and the fish would have technically been transported by a Canadian railway, thereby meaning the Jones Act wouldn't apply to the shipment. Now, saying it out loud makes the whole scheme sound ridiculous and an obvious attempt to get around regulations, which is what makes the fact American Seafood actually put this plan into motion even more hilarious. The company built 70 meters of track in Bayside in 2012, purchased a shunting tractor and 2 flatbed wagons, dubbed it the Bayside Canadian Railway, and put the plan into action. As absurd as the whole idea was, it worked. The fish no longer fell under the Jones Act, they didn't have to pay the New Brunswick Railway anymore, and American Seafood was still able to hire cheaper foreign ships to make the deliveries as a result. Eventually, all great scams come to an end, and the Bayside Canadian Railway was no different. In 2021, the US Customs and Border Protection finally cracked down on American Seafood after discovering the railway they were shipping goods on was actually a tiny section of track connected to nothing, stating that the Third Proviso exemption they were using only applied to through routes, aka railways that actually went somewhere, and as such, the Bayside Railway didn't count and the Jones Act would still apply. The case was taken to federal court, with the company stating that it was a registered Canadian rail line, and that there was no legal minimum distance required for the goods to travel for the exemption to apply. The court allowed American Seafood to continue the practice while the case was ongoing. By 2022, a district court judge from Alaska ruled that the railway was non-compliant with the Jones Act, and the railway was finally closed down in 2023, though the fines against the company were waived. As I said, railways have been built for many reasons and to serve many different purposes over the years, but out of them all, I think we can all agree that none may be quite as unique or bizarre as the Bayside Canadian Railway. In a world where new railways are becoming more and more of a rarity, it's nice to know that railways still have their place in the modern world, even if it is just to exploit a niche maritime law so a company can save money on transporting fish, in a way that's as obvious as it is hilarious. Subscribe for more.